Welcome back, everybody, to Rasputin Gaming Presents. This is another review after Platinum, and tonight I'm reviewing Outer Worlds after the Platinum Trophy. So, Obsidian, a developer that's made sequels to both BioWare's Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Bethesda's Fallout 3, has emerged those two distinctive flavors, and they go great together. I wouldn't quite call this a space frontier themed adventure, the best of both, but it's a creative and well-made take that's both familiar and new all at once. Outer Worlds is a lighthearted RPG that aims to emulate the Firefly fantasy. You fly from planet to planet, gather a crew of misfits, pick your way through a series of moral quandaries, and shoot people with cool lasers. The game's retro-futuristic aesthetic and dark sense of humor pitches The Outer Worlds against Bethesda's Fallout games, but there are important differences. True, you have ray guns and companions who will shoot enemies and stand around staring awkwardly into walls, but this game isn't a sprawling sandbox experience. Quite the opposite. You hop between planets and space stations, exploring fairly large zones full of corporate employees, staving off plagues and wild animal attacks. And the game is fairly linear with that. As you pick up each main quest, you are directed to one singular area to accomplish that. And it's darn near impossible to pick up quests that will allow you to travel different places in a true open world sandbox experience. Each area is loaded with loot and side quests, but it's a tight, narrow RPG. You fetch science fiction gadgets for quest givers and make some entertaining moral decisions. Your companion quests can keep you bouncing around from planet to planet and making it seem open world, but don't get fooled, that's not really the case. That's not a bad thing, but in the world of 70 plus hour RPGs, it's useful to set expectations. The Outer Worlds is a pulpy, choose your own adventure experience. If you don't go in expecting a deep systems driven sandbox, it's a pleasure to breeze through. I was able to complete my adventure to include both playthroughs in about 13 hours. Gameplay. It's a very familiar format to anybody that's played a Fallout game in that there are almost always multiple ways to fight, talk, or sneak your way through. And notably, there are different speech skills to lie, persuade, and intimidate your way past adversaries. Those all result in the same outcome if your skill is high enough to enable dialogue options, but it lets you have a say in whether your character plays the role of scoundrel, diplomat, or thug, allowing you a lot more of the RP part of the RPG. Accordingly, there's a faction reputation system in play that keeps track of who you've helped or who you've wronged, but it never really felt important because for the most part, its only rewards are discounts of up to 25% at vendors. And using vendors is rarely necessary, but it's nice to know someone cares. The nice thing about it is that losing some reputation is somewhat meaningful consequence for getting caught stealing people's trinkets, other than a potential game-ending fight with security or everything grinding to a halt while you break out of jail for the 8th time. Obsidian has its own clever thing to add to Outer Worlds, like the way skill and perk systems incorporate companions into your build by adding their stats to your own. So if you're concentrating on skills like guns and dialogue, you can balance yourself out by bringing along Max to boost your hacking and Parvati to boost your engineering. Since you can't control your companions directly, this solution makes a lot of sense, and it's one of the nice things about the Outer Worlds. On top of that, you get a good amount of old school control over companions' gear and perks, as their weapons, armor, and helmets must be managed and updated along with your own. You can even tweak their behavior settings, such as whether they should prefer ranged or melee weapons, or behave aggressively or defensively, without bogged down in the overcomplicated weeds. So you don't have to micromanage them. Your ability to set some overarching control modes for them is a positive for this game. Maybe most importantly, each one has a special combat skill that you can activate at will that effectively pauses the action so they can deliver a cinematic smackdown to your target. Those come in especially handy when you're overwhelmed. The cutscene attacks can give you a breather in a big fight, and a lot of them have stun effects on top of the big damage, and that can be a lifesaver when a huge beast is bearing down on you. Another very original feature of the Outer Worlds is faults, where you occasionally have the opportunity to opt into a weakness in exchange for a point that can unlock a powerful bonus in your perk tree. In my run, I got 3 of these in my primary run. It's needed to get a trophy anyways, so I accepted those to give me certain vulnerabilities to certain kinds of attacks, which are meaningful weaknesses, but rarely affected how I fought because I was charging into a fight. I generally wasn't taking stock of whether they were shooting me with plasma or corrosion or I was fighting against automechs. Kind of really, I mean, it was there, but it didn't really matter a whole lot. The one I had to consider more often gave me a debuff whenever I took fall damage. I like when a game thinks outside the box and influences my behavior without resorting to percentages. I don't know how many of these possibilities exist, but I'm glad they do. They're not a huge difference, but they're an unpredictable random element that makes each playthrough unique, and that makes me even more interested to play through the game. Narrative. The crux of this science fiction setup is that, among other things, the Halcyon system is owned and run entirely by a board of corporations, and their presence is a big deal. Whole planets are owned by the core, looking to use their ecosystems as part of a larger supply chain, and numerous vending machines from different companies populate towns, trying to attract you with their bright logos and jingles. In fact, the Outer Worlds is saturated with strikingly colorful locales. The planets you'll visit are impressively varied and sometimes beautiful, flaunting in H.G. Wells-like retro-futuristic aesthetic. On the first impression, corporations appear as mostly a static layer folded into the world. A number of the companies mentioned seem to mostly just exist as manufacturers of weapons and consumables, a piece of flair to keep the tone light in the same way that the circus of values exists in BioShock, but it's far more ingrained than that. Corporate capitalism so deeply affects everything in the Outer Worlds, and explorations into how it can affect society on a variety of levels is surprisingly well considered constant despite the semblance of parody. You'll meet sympathetic workers whose livelihoods are not only made possible by offering themselves to exploitation and indentured servitude, white-collared outlaws who are more bureaucrats than pirates, and well-meaning middle managers who are trying to change the corporate machine from inside. You'll find moderates, idealists, extremists, and most things in between and around the fringes, all of which have their own feasible ideas about how to best serve the colony or themselves. By the time the climax hits, it's clear that the Outer Worlds has its own stance on this bleak future. But that doesn't stop the world it creates, the sojourns you take, and the characters you meet along the way from being any less fascinating. Your companions have their own stories too. They aren't as meaningful as, say, Mass Effect's companions, but they regularly chip in on conversations. The voice acting is great, but NPCs and companions seem stilted and unmoving during conversations. There's some extremely aggressive zoom when you initiate conversation, right into the person you're talking to's face, which takes me all the way back to some looming potato faces of Oblivion, and it can matter which companions you take on which missions. Graphics. The game's retro-futuristic stylings hold up well. There's a ton of color variety everywhere you go. I did not find stiffness in the character models or repeated use of assets or building models either. Despite the aggressive zoom in on faces of the person you are talking to being a little disjointed and disruptive, it does seem to work well as their faces are lively and animated. Additionally, I did not experience any technical issues around other parts of graphics or looks of the game. Audio. The audio features of the game are a bare minimum. There is nothing in the way of flavorful background sound like in Ghost of Tsushima, for example. The sounds for the weapons in combat are satisfying and do not detract from the game. The best thing to say about the audio is that while it doesn't hurt the game, neither does it enhance the game. Replayability. The Outer World lends itself fairly well to replayability. Since there are multiple ways to resolve quests, most have a couple options for ending choices. There's also the additional options of whether through combat or dialogue you will decide how to solve each quest. And if you choose dialogue options, there is a number of different ways to approach dialogue as well. Although it appears at first blush that there are multiple dialogue options, the end result is that it doesn't matter if you persuade, lie, or intimidate, all dialogue options end with the same result. It's just a matter of how you want to role play your character through. But having the option for multiple dialogues and or combat options does allow more replayability in the game. Adding to the replayability factors that you can play the Outer Worlds with different degrees of difficulty. If you're playing through a full playthrough on Supernova difficulty, you will have to be at your best to make it to the end without rage quitting. The game can be longer than expected on the higher difficulties as the combat challenges increase and you have to pay some attention to min-maxing. Fun. I found this game fun. When it started to bog down in repeatability, the dialogue and or the setting brought it up out of its doldrums. The gunplay is fun, although somewhat restricted to two styles, melee or ranged. There are different damage types that, unless you are on Supernova difficulty, don't really make much of a difference, which allows you to play through in whichever manner is most fun. If you do not carefully manage your quests and your companion quests, you can find yourself flying back and forth between these planets multiple times just to clean up stuff which could have been handled before. This does detract from the fun if you are not careful about scheduling planetary visits and quest requirements. Ability to Platinum. Outer Worlds can be problematic to Platinum. It requires two separate playthroughs to get to the Platinum Trophy. There are branching storylines that make it a practical necessity to run it twice. Combat on Supernova difficulty, as mentioned before, can be mentally draining and can get tiresome in a hurry. You really have to put a lot of work into min-maxing, picking the right types of damage for the kind of enemy you're fighting, and really take tactical advantage of your TTD options. To make your ability to platinum a little bit easier, if you follow my platinum trophy guides, you can chop this game down to two manageable playthroughs with the Supernova difficulty basically being a speed run without combat. As I mentioned before, I was able to blast through the Supernova difficulty, avoiding all combat and only hitting the necessary story points to get to the end of the game. By doing so, I was able to secure the Platinum Trophy in just 13 hours, with the Supernova run only taking me slightly longer than 90 minutes. So now the part you've all been waiting for, the ratings. So overall, I give gameplay an 8. It's great gameplay, and there's plenty of options, the different damage types, the different types of guns, and the options for dialogue really put enough variety into the gameplay to make it worth an 8, which on my scale it equals great. The narrative is great. You have to spend quite a bit of time paying attention to the dialogue of the corporate schmoes that you come across and the workers that are being ground under their heel. But if you do pay attention to it, there is definitely a good narrative there. And I gave the narrative an 8. Graphics are a 7. Lost a point or two due to the zooming in on the faces of the people you're dialoguing with. And some of the colors on the graphics get pretty harsh, and it's hard to distinguish between what is terrain and what are enemies in the game. So with that, for graphics, I gave it a 7 as good. Audio in this game, I gave it a 5, which is mediocre. There's not much to enhance or detract from the game, thus it gets a score right in the middle of the pack. Replayability, I gave it a 7. It's good replayability. You can pick different styles of way to play through the game. You can change the difficulty as well. That would change how the game gets played and how you can approach the game. So that adds to the replayability factor. For fun, I gave it a 7. Also good. While I found the game fun for the most part, there was some tedious spots with overlapping quests. If you don't line them up right, you can spend a lot of extra time bouncing around the places you have been. It's easy to miss some side quests as well and how to complete some of them. and not all of the quest markers work the way you would like them to work. And if you do not stay on top of the tinkering and the mods for your weapons, and the game doesn't make it really clear that you need to do that to keep up with the difficulty challenge, even if you're playing on the easiest difficulty, makes it somewhat less fun than it ought to be. So overall, I gave the game a 7 as well. It's a good game. It's quite enjoyable. I was happy to have platinum it. It was not tedious to do the platinum for me. Like I said, it took 13 hours to complete 2 runs through, with the supernova run only taking me just over 90 minutes. I think it took like 93 minutes. And you can easily get the supernova run done if you follow my guide in less than 2 hours. And if you're even more efficient than I was, you can probably get it done in 70, 80 minutes. So ability to platinum, I gave it a 7. It's it's good, but you have to really be utilizing a guide, and it can be somewhat challenging to get all the trophies if you aren't following a guide. So I want to thank you all for following along. Don't forget to friend and follow us on Twitch. If you're on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you've checked out multiples of my videos or my reviews, it means you're enjoying the content, and I would really appreciate the subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and I would appreciate having you guys along. So you guys take care, be safe out there, and we will catch you next time.